Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Tonight we're taking a gentle journey back through time to an era when the world moved at the pace of oxen, when candlelight flickered against stone walls, and when the rhythm of life was dictated not by clocks but by the rising and setting of the sun. As we settle in, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? There's something soothing about realizing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but sharing the same quiet moment. And if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. The Middle Ages. 1,000 years of human experience that stretched from roughly 500 to 500 common eras. You've perhaps imagined knights in shining armor, fair maidens in towers, and grand feasts in torchlit halls. But tonight we'll explore the quieter truths of medieval life, the daily struggles and small victories, the intimate details of how people lived, loved, suffered, and dreamed in a world so different from our own. Imagine yourself settling into the soft comfort of your bed, your pillow supporting your head, your blankets warm against your skin. Feel grateful for the simple luxuries that surround you, the clean water that flows from your tap, the light that appears at the flip of a switch, the medicine cabinet stocked with remedies our medieval ancestors could never have imagined. Tonight, as we wander through their world, you'll come to appreciate just how far we've traveled together as a species. We'll begin our journey in the mud-soaked lanes of a 14th century English village, where you'll experience the harsh realities of peasant life. Then we'll follow the tragic tale of Queen Margherita de Borgana, whose story illuminates the dangerous game of medieval court politics. From there, we'll descend into the bone-like tunnels beneath Paris, exploring how death and faith shaped medieval cities. Finally, we'll warm ourselves by the great hearths of castle halls, discovering that even privilege came with its own particular burdens. Let the present world fade away now. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. As we step backward through centuries, into a time when life was simpler in some ways, yet infinitely more precarious in others. You wake before dawn in your medieval bed, though bed is perhaps too generous a term. It's a straw-stuffed mattress shared with your spouse and children, and possibly a traveling stranger seeking shelter for the night. The straw changed perhaps twice a year. If you're fortunate, crackles beneath you as you shift. It's October in the year 1348, and the morning air carries that particular bite that promises winter's approach. Your first sensation isn't sight, it's smell. The mingled odors of unwashed bodies, rotting thatch, and animal waste create a tapestry of scent that would overwhelm a modern nose. But this is your world, as familiar as breathing. You've never known the sharp, clean scent of soap. That luxury belongs to the very wealthy, if it exists at all. In your village, outside your single-room dwelling, you can hear the village stirring to life. A rooster crows, then another. The soft going of cattle drifts from the common fields. Someone coughs, a deep, rattling sound that speaks of lungs thick with moisture and time. Disease is always present here, a constant companion that might take a neighbor today, child tomorrow. Perhaps by winter's end you rise from your bed, your joints protesting. You're 35 years old, ancient by medieval standards, your body already bearing the accumulated weight of a lifetime of hard labor. Your back aches from yesterday's work in the fields, bending and lifting, cutting and gathering. Your hands are calloused and cracked, stained with dirt that no amount of cold water can fully remove. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, swept clean but still dusty. Your home consists of this single room, perhaps 12 FX 16 FT housing your entire family. Privacy is a concept that doesn't exist in your vocabulary. Every conversation is heard. Every moment of intimacy observed by children who learn about life from watching their parents navigate survival. In the dim pre-dawn light filtering through your single window, an unglazed opening covered with oiled cloth, you can see your meager possessions. A wooden chest holds your few clothes, a rough wool and tunic frieze, and a single cloak for winter. Your Sunday clothes hang on a peg marginally better than your work attire, save for church and special occasions. You own perhaps 3 complete sets of clothing, and you'll wear each until it literally falls apart. Your wife is already stirring the embers in the central fire pit, coaxing flame from the carefully banked coals. Wood is precious. Every stick must be gathered from the Lord's forest, and only certain types of deadfall are permitted to be taken. To be caught. Cutting living wood without permission could mean a heavy fine a day in the stocks or worse. The smoke from the fire has no proper chimney to escape through, instead rising to blacken the thatch overhead before seeping out through gaps in the roof. Breakfast, if it can be called that, consists of yesterday's bread. Dark, dense rye that has the consistency of leather and tastes faintly of the argot fungus that sometimes grows on rye grains. This fun, which you cannot see or taste until too late, can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and death. But hunger is a more immediate threat than possible poison, so you chew the tough bread and wash it down with small beer. Safer than water, which often carries diseases. You have no names, for the bread itself tells the story of your social position. White bread is for the wealthy, made from wheat flour that has been sifted and refined. Your bread is coarse and dark, made from whatever grain survived the last harvest. It's often mixed with peas, beans, or even ground acorns. When times are truly desperate, you can tell the social class of any person in your village simply by the color of their bread. As the first pale light creeps across the sky, you prepare for your day's work. But first you must attend to more immediate needs. There is no bathroom in your home, no running water, no sewage system. The village has a few communal latrines, simple wooden seats built over deep pits that are emptied perhaps once a year. Privacy is minimal, and the smell in summer is overwhelming. Most villagers prefer to relieve themselves in their own garden plots, where the waste can fertilize their meager vegetable patches. Water must be fetched from the village well or nearby stream. This is typically women's work, and you watch your wife and daughters join the line of other women, each carrying wooden buckets or clay pots. The water they bring back is often cloudy, sometimes tasting of the animals that drink upstream. You've learned to let it settle before drinking, and you always boil it if someone in the household shows signs of stomach sickness. Personal hygiene, as you understand it, involves washing your hands and face with cold water, perhaps once a day. Full body washing is rare, maybe once a month, if that. The church teaches that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness is a form of vanity, a sin that might endanger your soul. Besides, heating enough water for a full bath requires precious fuel, and your wooden tub, shared with the entire family, is more often used for laundry than bathing. Your teeth, by modern standards, are in terrible condition. You've never owned a toothbrush, never heard of dental hygiene. You clean your teeth occasionally by rubbing them with a rough cloth, sometimes dipping it in salt if you can afford it. Most adults your age have lost several. Teeth and dental pain is simply another fact of life to be endured. When a tooth becomes so infected that it threatens your life, the local barber might extract it with crude tools and no anesthesia, except perhaps a cup of strong ale. As you dress for the day, you're grateful for the wool and undergarments that provide some warmth against the October chill. Wool is a blessing. It retains warmth even when damp, and it's relatively durable. Your outer tunic is also wool, dyed with local plants to a dull brown or green color. Bright colors like red, blue, or purple require expensive dyes and are reserved for the wealthy. Your shoes, if you're fortunate enough to own them, are simple leather affairs, more like soft slippers than the structured footwear of later eras. Many villagers go barefoot most of the year, developing thick, calloused soles that can handle rough ground and sharp stones. In winter, you might stuff your shoes with straw for extra warmth, but frostbite is still a real danger during the coldest months. The sun is now fully risen, and the workday begins in earnest. Your life revolves around the agricultural seasons, and October means harvest time, if there is anything to harvest. This year has been particularly difficult. The rains came too late in spring, then too heavily in summer, and now there's talk of strange sickness affecting both people and animals in neighboring villages. You walk to your assigned strips of land in the common fields. Medieval agriculture operates on a complex system of shared labor and divided plots. You don't own your land. It belongs to your lord, who allows you to work certain strips in exchange for labor service on his personal lands, called the domain. Several days each week you must work the Lord's fields before tending to your own. The tools you carry are simple but effective. A wooden plow pulled by ox and sickle for cutting grain, Flail for threshing and various wooden implements for planting and cultivating. Iron is expensive, so only the cutting edges of your tools are made of metal. Everything else is wood, leather, or rope. As you work in the fields, your world is defined by the rhythm of physical labor. Your body moves in patterns refined by generations of farmers. The swing of the sickle, the steady pace of oxen, the bend and straighten of gathering grain. There are no machines to ease your burden, no fertilizers to improve your yield, no weather forecasting to help you plan. Work with your hands, your back, and your accumulated knowledge of local conditions. The other villagers work alongside you and conversation flows naturally as hands stay busy. You discuss the weather, the health of livestock, the quality of this year's harvest compared to last. Someone mentions that the miller's son has developed a fever and a subtle anxiety passes through the group. Fever often precedes death, and once sickness enters a household, it rarely leaves everyone alive. Your social world is small and intimate. You know every person in your village of perhaps 150 souls. You know who drinks too much, who beats their wife, who has been secretly meeting with whom behind the church. Privacy, like personal space, is a luxury you cannot afford. Every transgression, every hardship, every small joy is shared among the community, whether you want it to be or not. The church bell rings the canonical hours, dividing your day into segments of prayer and work. Primar sex non vespers complain. These Latin words mark the passage of time more reliably than any clock. When the bell rings, you pause in your work, cross yourself and offer a brief prayer. Religion is not separate from daily life. It's woven into every aspect of your existence like the wool in your tunic. Speaking of the church, it dominates your village both physically and spiritually. The stone church building is probably the largest structure you'll ever enter. Its walls thick and solid, its interior echoing with centuries of prayers. The priest, one of the few literate people in your community, serves as teacher, judge, and intermediary between your world and the divine. But the church also serves as tax collector and moral arbiter. You must pay a tithe 1/10 of your produce to support the church, even in years when you can barely feed your own family. The priest watches for signs of heretical thinking, reports unusual behavior to higher authorities, and reminds you constantly that your earthly suffering is preparation for heavenly reward. As midday approaches, you pause for a meal of bread, cheese, and perhaps a bit of bacon. If you're fortunate, you eat with your hands, using your knife to cut larger pieces. Forks don't exist in your world. They won't be common for several more centuries. You drink small beer or watered wine, safer than the local water supply. The afternoon brings more work, but also the social interactions that make village life bearable. Women gather to spin wool, sharing gossip and wisdom. Men repair tools and discuss plans for next year's planting. Children run between the adults, learning by observation and occasional instruction. There are no schools in your village, no books, no formal education, except what the church provides on Sundays. As evening approaches, the character of your world changes. Without electric lights, darkness has a weight and presence that modern people rarely experience. Candles are expensive, made from tallow or beeswax, used sparingly and only when necessary. Most evening activities occur by firelight, which flickers and dances, casting moving shadows that create an ever-changing landscape of light and dark. Your evening meal consists of pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat you can gather. The same iron pot serves for cooking day after day, rarely cleaned thoroughly, developing a patina of accumulated meals that actually helps preserve food and adds flavor. You eat this meal with wooden spoons from wooden bowls, sharing dishes among family members. After the evening meal, if you have energy remaining, you might engage in the simple entertainments available to your class. Someone might tell a story, often a religious tale or local legend passed down through generations. Women continue their spinning and mending by firelight. Men might discuss village business or settle disputes that arose during the day's work. But entertainment is a luxury you can rarely afford. Your body is tired from the day's labor, and tomorrow will bring the same routine of dawn to dusk work. You go to bed shortly after sunset, conserving precious fuel and allowing your body the rest it desperately needs. As you lie in your straw bed, Listening to the breathing of your family members beside you, your mind might wander to thoughts of the future. But the future in your world looks remarkably like the present. You don't expect technological progress or social advancement. Your children will likely live much the same life you've lived, working the same fields, worrying about the same problems of weather, disease, and survival. Yet there's a certain peace in this predictability, a rhythm that connects you to the natural world in ways that later generations will lose. Know the signs of changing weather, the habits of local animals, the best times for planting and harvesting. Your knowledge is practical, earned through experience passed down from parents who learned it from their parents. The medieval village, for all its hardships, operates as a functioning community, where everyone has a role and mutual dependence creates strong social bonds. When crisis strikes, and it often does, neighbors help neighbors because they know their own survival depends on the community's survival. Winter approaches, and you can feel it in the morning chill, see it in the earlier sunsets, sense it in the restlessness of the animals. This will be the test of your preparations, your endurance, your luck. Some years everyone survives until spring. Other years, the very young and very old don't see the first flowers bloom. But for now, at this moment between wake and sleep, you rest in the certainty of routine, the comfort of familiar discomfort, in the hope that tomorrow will bring another day of life. In a world where simply surviving until evening is an achievement worthy of quiet pride, the last sound you hear before sleep claims you is the distant howl of a wolf, reminding you that civilization is still a fragile thing, a small circle of firelight surrounded by vast darkness, full of mysteries and dangers that daylight keeps at bay. But let us linger a moment longer in this medieval world, exploring the deeper currents that flow beneath the surface of daily survival. Your village exists within a complex web of obligations and relationships that stretch far beyond its boundaries, connecting you to a feudal system that has shaped European society for centuries. Your lord, whose manor house sits on the hill overlooking your fields, is himself bound by oaths of fealty to greater nobles who in turn serve kings and emperors. This chain of obligation extends from the humblest serf to the most powerful monarch, making a social structure that seems as permanent and unchanging as the stones of the church walls. Yet even in this rigid hierarchy, there are subtle forms of resistance and negotiation. When the harvest fails, villagers might petition for reduced rents. When the lord demands excessive labor service, the community might work slowly or claim illness. These small acts of defiance rarely challenge the system directly, but they create space for survival within an often harsh framework of exploitation. The seasons govern not just your agricultural work, but the entire rhythm of medieval life. Spring brings hope and backbreaking, labor as fields are prepared and planted. Summer means long days of cultivation and the constant worry about weather. Too much rain, too little rain, hail that can destroy months of work in minutes. Autumn is harvest time, a period of intense activity as the entire community races to gather crops before winter's arrival. Winter, though, reveals the true character of medieval existence. This is when stored food runs low, when the cold penetrates every corner of your inadequately heated home, when sickness spreads most quickly through weakened populations. January and February are the killing months, when death visits most frequently and the gap between survival and starvation narrows to a razor's edge. During these darkest months, your diet becomes increasingly creative and desperate. The last of the preserved meat disappears by mid-winter. Root vegetables stored in underground pits grow soft and sometimes rotten. The grain that seemed adequate in October must be stretched ever thinner. As winter wears on, you learn to make soup from bones picked clean weeks ago to find nutrition in scraps that would horrify more prosperous times. Yet winter also brings its own forms of community, solidarity. Families crowd together for warmth, sharing body heat as well as resources. Storytelling becomes more important as the long nights stretch endlessly. The church provides not just spiritual comfort but practical charity, distributing food to the most desperate and offering sanctuary to those who have lost their homes to fire or flood. The medieval village operates on principles of mutual aid that go far beyond simple charity. When a family's house burns down, a constant danger with open fires and thatched Roof's neighbors automatically contribute materials and labor for rebuilding. When someone falls seriously ill, others tend their fields without expectation of immediate repayment. These acts of cooperation aren't motivated by altruism alone. They're insurance policies. In a world where anyone might face catastrophe at any moment, marriage in your social class is primarily an economic arrangement. Though affection often grows between couples who share the struggles of survival, a wife brings a small down, perhaps a cow, some household goods, a bit of land, while a husband provides protection and labor. Weddings are community celebrations, but also business transactions that strengthen alliances between families and redistribute resources within the village. Children in medieval villages grow up quickly, assuming adult responsibilities by ages that would seem shockingly young today. 10-year-old boy might tend livestock alone in distant pastures. 12-year-old girl might manage household duties while her mother works in the fields. Education, as we understand it, doesn't exist for your social class, but learning occurs constantly through observation and participation in adult activities. The relationship between medieval villagers and the natural world differs fundamentally from modern attitudes toward nature. You don't see yourself as separate from the environment, but as part of an interconnected system that includes animals, plants, weather, and spiritual forces. The forest isn't just a source of wood and game. It's a living entity with its own moods and dangers, home to wolves and bears, but also to fairies and spirits that might help or harm, depending on how they're treated. This worldview extends to your understanding of illness and healing. Disease isn't just a physical condition, but often a spiritual affliction, requiring both herbal remedies and prayer. The village wise woman who knows which plants can reduce fever or ease childbirth pain works, alongside the priest who offers prayers and holy relics. Both approaches are considered necessary for true healing. Agricultural techniques in your time rely on accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, but they're also surprisingly sophisticated for their technological limitations. Crop rotation helps maintain soil fertility. Selective breeding improves livestock. Careful observation of weather patterns guides planting decisions. Your ancestors have learned to work with natural cycles, rather than attempting to dominate them. The tools of medieval agriculture tell their own story of human ingenuity. Constrained by limited resources, your plow, made mostly of wood with only the cutting blade forged from precious iron, can break ground effectively, but requires careful maintenance and skilled operation. Your sickle, worn smooth by countless harvests, fits your hand perfectly but must be sharpened constantly on a whetstone carried in your belt. Pouch. Village crafts operate on principles of specialization within a very small community. The blacksmith doesn't just make horseshoes and nails. He repairs plows, sharpens tools, and creates the metal fittings that hold wooden structures together. The miller controls access to the grinding stones that turn grain into flour, making him one of the most important and sometimes most resented members of the community. The carpenter builds houses, makes furniture, and crafts the wooden tools that everyone uses daily. These craftsmen occupy a social position slightly above ordinary peasants, but far below the nobility. They often own their shops and tools, giving them more economic independence than field workers. However, they're still subject to their lord's authority and must pay taxes and fees like everyone else in the village. The church calendar provides structure for medieval life beyond just marking the passage of time. Holy days throughout the year bring breaks from regular work, opportunities for community celebration, and reminders of spiritual obligations. Christmas, Easter harvest festivals, and saints' days create a rhythm of sacred time that interrupts the routine of survival and connects your small village to the larger Christian community. Religious observance in medieval villages goes far beyond Sunday Mass, though that weekly gathering serves as the primary social event for the entire community. Daily prayers mark the canonical hours, blessing and sanctifying ordinary activities. Religious processions invoke divine protection for crops, and livestock pilgrimages to nearby shrines offer both spiritual merit and rare opportunities for travel beyond the village boundaries. The medieval understanding of justice differs significantly from modern legal systems. Village disputes are often settled by community consensus rather than formal courts. The lord's reeve, chosen from among the peasants themselves, mediates conflicts and enforces basic order. Serious crimes might be referred to the Lord's Manor Court, but most village justice operates on principles of restoration rather than punishment. Public shaming serves as a powerful tool for maintaining social order in communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. The stocks in the village square aren't just for punishing criminals, they're for displaying social disapproval of behavior that threatens community harmony. Someone caught cheating in business dealings, spreading malicious gossip, or failing to fulfill their obligations might spend a day being pelted with rotten vegetables and verbal abuse. As winter deepens and the year draws toward its close, your thoughts turn increasingly towards survival and preparation for the challenges ahead. The Christmas season brings brief respite from the grinding routine of subsistence. Special foods hoarded for the celebration and religious services that offer hope for salvation in a world filled with suffering. Yet even in the midst of medieval hardship, moments of genuine joy and beauty punctuate the struggle for existence. A successful harvest brings community celebration and temporary relief from hunger's constant presence. The birth of a healthy child represents hope for the future and additional labor for family survival. Particularly beautiful sunrise or sunset, witnessed while walking to work in the fields, provides a moment of transcendence that reminds you that life contains wonder alongside its burdens. The medieval village at night becomes a different world, entirely transformed by darkness and the play of fire. Light against familiar surroundings, shadows dance on wall and ceiling, creating an ever-changing landscape of light and dark that would be alien to anyone accustomed to electric illumination. The sounds of night wind and thatch animals settling in their shelters, the distant call of an owl, create an acoustic environment that connects you directly to the natural rhythms of your world. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers escape from the day's accumulated fatigue and tomorrow's looming challenges. Dreams might bring visions of better times, memories of loved ones, strange symbolic narratives that blend daily concerns with spiritual longings. The medieval mind makes no sharp distinction between waking and sleeping consciousness, viewing both as valid forms of experience that might bring messages from divine or supernatural sources. And so, as you settle deeper into your straw mattress, sharing warmth with family members whose breathing provides a reassuring rhythm in the darkness, you rest in the knowledge that you have survived another day in a world where survival itself is never guaranteed. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same small victories and defeats, the same endless cycle of work and rest that has defined human existence for countless generations. Before you, the wolf's howl fades into silence, replaced by the gentler sounds of a village at rest, and you drift towards sleep, knowing that whatever tomorrow brings, you will meet it with the same quiet endurance that has carried your people through countless tomorrows before. Let us now leave the mud and smoke of the medieval village behind and ascend to the rarefied air of royal courts, where power and privilege create their own particular forms of suffering. Here in the gleaming halls of 14th century France, we encounter a woman whose story illustrates how even queens could become pawns in games far larger than themselves. Close your eyes and imagine the soft rustle of silk against stone floors, the warm glow of countless candles reflecting off polished surfaces, the subtle perfume of rose water and spices that marks the presence of nobility. This is a world of luxury unimaginable to the peasants we've just left, yet it proves to be no less dangerous, no less capable of destroying human dreams and aspirations. Margarita de Borgana was born into privilege around the year 1290, daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful nobles in France. From her earliest childhood, she would have been surrounded by tapestries depicting heroic deeds, illuminated manuscripts that told stories of courtly love, the constant presence of servants whose entire existence revolved around maintaining the comfort and dignity of their noble masters. Picture young Margarita learning to walk across floors of polished stone, her small feet encased in soft leather shoes that would be replaced the moment they showed wear. Her clothing would have been made from the finest wool and linen, dyed in rich colors that proclaimed her family's wealth and status. Even as a child, she would have understood that her appearance reflected not just her own worth, but the honor of her entire lineage. The castle where she spent her childhood would have been a world unto itself, with its own chapel, its own kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, its own armory, and stables and workshops. Yet for all its size and grandeur, it was also a prison of sorts, its thick walls defining the boundaries of acceptable behavior. For a young woman of noble birth, Margaret's education would have focused on the skills deemed appropriate for her station: fine needlework that could produce tapestries and ecclesiastical vestments, music that could provide entertainment at court gatherings, enough Latin to follow religious services, and the complex etiquette that governed every aspect of noble interaction. She would have learned to move with grace, to speak with carefully modulated tones, to eat delicate foods with instruments of silver and gold. But, perhaps most importantly, she would have learned that her body, her affections, and her future belonged not to herself, but to the political needs of her family and kingdom. Marriage for women of her class was a diplomatic tool, a way of cementing alliances and consolidating power. Love, if it came at all, was expected to follow marriage rather than precede it. In 1305, when Margarita was approximately 15 years old, she was married to Louis X of France, then heir to the throne and known as Louis Poutin, Louis the Quarrelsome. This marriage united the royal house of Capeta with the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, strengthening both dynasties and creating bonds that were expected to last for generations. The wedding itself would have been a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence. Imagine the great cathedral filled with the highest nobility of France, their clothing glittering with gold thread and precious gems. The air would have been thick with incense and the sound of sacred music, while outside the common people pressed close to glimpse their future queen in her wedding finery. Louis, her new husband, was a man of complex character, intelligent and cultured, but also quick to anger and suspicious of those around him. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically attractive but emotionally unstable, given to sudden rages and equally sudden displays of generosity. Stepping into marriage with such a man would have required all the diplomatic skills her noble upbringing had taught her. The early years of their marriage seemed to follow the expected pattern of royal unions. Margarita adapted to life at the French court, one of the most sophisticated in Europe, where corridors sang of courtly love while nobles engaged in intricate political dances that could elevate or destroy reputations. Overnight, she learned to navigate the complex web of relationships that connected various noble houses, understanding that a careless word or misinterpreted gesture could have consequences far beyond her immediate circumstances. Court life in early 14th century, France operated according to rituals that had evolved over centuries. Each day followed prescribed patterns of religious observance, meals taken in the Great Hall according to strict hierarchical seating arrangements, and entertainments that served as much to display wealth and power as to provide enjoyment. Margarita would have presided over many of these ceremonies, her every gesture watched and interpreted by courtiers seeking clues to royal favor or disfavor. The Queen's daily routine began before dawn with private prayers in her chamber, attended by ladies in waiting who helped her dress in garments that took hours to put on properly, layer upon layer of silk and wool, each piece carefully chosen to convey the appropriate message about her status and the enmity of her duties. Her hair, never seen uncovered in public, would be arranged in elaborate styles that required the skills of specialized servants. Breakfast in the royal household was a formal affair, even when taken privately. Gold and silver vessels held foods that represented the bounty of the kingdom: fresh bread made from the finest wheat, meat from royal hunting preserves, fruits preserved in honey and exotic spices. Yet Margarita would have eaten sparingly, constrained by the same rules of feminine deportment that governed every aspect of her public presentation. The morning hours might be spent in receiving petitioners, women of lesser nobility, who sought her intercession in various matters, a merchant's wife hoping for royal protection in a business dispute, a mother seeking a position for her son in the royal household, beast requesting funding for her. Convent all would approach the Queen with carefully rehearsed speeches and elaborate displays of deference. Afternoon activities varied, according to the season and the political calendar. During times of peace, Margarita might oversee the creation of elaborate tapestries, sit for portraits that would be sent to foreign courts as diplomatic gifts, or participate in the complex negotiations that surrounded royal marriages. For younger members of the royal family, during times of tension or war, her duties might include managing communications with allied nobles, overseeing the preparation of supplies for military campaigns, or maintaining morale among the court ladies whose husbands and brothers were away fighting. Evening entertainment. In the royal court represented the pinnacle of medieval cultural achievement. Margarita would have presided over feasts that lasted for hours, featuring dozens of courses prepared by master cooks who treated their craft as high art. Musicians, poets, and storytellers provided entertainment that ranged from sacred music honoring God and King to more secular performances that celebrated earthly love and heroic adventure. Yet for all the luxury that surrounded her, Margaret's life was constrained by expectations that left little room for personal choice or spontaneous feeling. Every relationship had political implications. Every decision required consideration of how it might affect the stability of the kingdom. The queen existed as a public figure first, and a private person second, her individual desires subordinated to the greater needs of dynasty and realm. It was within this context of rigid protocol and political calculation that Margarita encountered the young knights who would ultimately destroy her carefully constructed world. The French court, for all its formality, was also a place where young men and women of noble birth mingled in circumstances that could give rise to genuine emotional connections, despite the official emphasis on duty and propriety. Among these young courters were Philippe, Dona and Gautier Don, brothers who served as squires in the royal household. Both were handsome, accomplished in the arts of war and courtly behavior, and possessed of that particular charm that comes from youth, combined with perfect training and aristocratic manners. They moved through the court with the confidence of men destined for advancement, their future seemingly assured by their skill at arms and their ability to navigate the complex social currents of royal favor. The exact nature of Margaret's relationship with these young men remains shrouded in the mists of historical ambiguity, complicated by the political motivations of those who recorded and interpreted the events that followed. What we know with certainty is that by 1314, rumors had begun to circulate suggesting that the Queen and her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Jean, wives of Charles and Philip, respectively, had been conducting improper relationships with various young knights of the court. These rumors might have remained mere gossip, a kind of scandalous speculation that always swirled around royal courts, where beautiful women and handsome men lived in proximity. However, they came to the attention of Isabella of France, daughter of Philip Isth and sister to Louis the Fervid X, a woman whose sharp intelligence and political acumen made her one of the most formidable figures in European politics. Isabella, later known to history as the Chevalier of France, was at this time married to Edward II of England, a union that had been arranged to strengthen the alliance between England and France. However, her marriage had proven deeply unhappy, largely due to Edward's preference for male favorites over his queen. This personal disappointment may have sharpened Isabella's eye for detecting similar situations in other royal marriages, or it may have made her more willing to believe the worst about the romantic entanglements of other royal women. Whether motivated by genuine moral outrage, political calculation, or personal vindictiveness, Isabella chose to bring these rumors to the attention of her father, King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. The king's reaction was swift and merciless, reflecting both his personal sense of betrayal and his understanding of the political implications of such a scandal. The confrontation that followed became known as the Trestle Affair, named after the tower where some of the alleged meetings between the queens and their lovers were said to have taken place. In April 1314, the storm that had been gathering around Margarita and her companions finally broke with devastating force. Felipe and Gautier, Dona, were arrested and subjected to interrogation that medieval chroniclers describe in terms that suggest torture was employed to extract confessions. The details of what they confessed, if anything, remain unclear, but the outcome was swift and brutal. Both young men were publicly executed in a manner designed to serve as a warning to others who might consider betraying the honor of the royal family. The execution was carried out with the elaborate ceremony that medieval justice reserved for crimes against the crown, the Brothers were stripped of their knightly status and their heraldic symbols publicly destroyed, before being subjected to the agonizing death reserved for traitors. Contemporary accounts suggest that they died slowly, their suffering prolonged as a demonstration of royal power and divine justice. For Margarita and her sisters-in-law, the punishment took a different but no less devastating form. All three women were tried for adultery, a crime that, when committed by queens, threatened the very legitimacy of royal succession. The political implications were staggering. If the queens had indeed been unfaithful, the paternity of any future heirs would be called into question, potentially destabilizing the entire kingdom. The trial itself was less a judicial proceeding than a political ritual designed to restore royal authority and demonstrate that even queens were subject to divine and earthly justice. Margarita was stripped of her royal titles, her marriage declared null, and her person committed to the custody of the church for penance and punishment. The sentence was imprisonment for life in the Château Galliard, a fortress built by Richard the Lionheart during the Crusades. It's now repurposed as a prison for royal prisoners, whose continued existence was inconvenient but whose deaths might prove politically problematic. The castle, perched on a cliff overlooking the Seine River, offered spectacular views of the Norman countryside. But for Margarita, it would serve as both sanctuary and tomb. Imagine her final departure from the court where she had reigned as queen, perhaps wearing the simple woolen robes of a penitent rather than the silken gold of royalty. The journey to Château Galliard would have taken several days, time enough for contemplation of how completely her world had changed, how thoroughly her dreams of queenship had been replaced by the reality of permanent exile. The castle itself, though fortress rather than palace, maintained certain standards appropriate to housing a former queen. Margarita would have had her own chambers, attended by a small staff of servants, provided with adequate food and clothing, and the luxury was hollow, designed more to maintain royal dignity than to provide genuine comfort, and always overshadowed by the knowledge that these walls would never be left behind. Days in her prison would have followed their own rhythm, structured around religious observances that served as both spiritual discipline and temporal routine. Morning prayers, midday devotions, evening vespers. The canonical hours that had once marked her participation in court ceremonies now served to divide the endless succession of empty hours that stretched ahead, without hope of change or release. Margaret's thoughts during these months of imprisonment can only be imagined, but they must have returned frequently to the choices and circumstances that had brought her to such a pass. Had she indeed committed adultery, betraying her marriage vows and royal duties for the sake of romantic passion? Or had she fallen victim to political machinations destroyed by rumors and allegations that bore little relationship to actual events? The historical record provides no clear answer to these questions, and perhaps the truth was less important than its appearance. In the world of medieval politics, perception often mattered more than reality, and the appearance of royal improperly could be as damaging to political stability as actual wrongdoing. What we know with certainty is that Margaret's imprisonment lasted less than a year. In August 1315, just 16 months after her arrest and trial, she died in Château Galliard under circumstances that remain mysterious. Official records attribute her death to natural causes, but the timing and location have led many historians to suspect a more sinister explanation. The most likely scenario is that Margarita was quietly murdered on the orders of her former husband, now King Louis X, who had remarried and required the legal certainty that only his first wife's death could provide. Such killings were not uncommon in medieval royal politics, where inconvenient spouses and rivals often died of sudden illnesses or accidents that raised few questions among contemporaries who understood the brutal realities of dynastic politics. Margaret's death removed the last obstacle to Louis' marriage and the legitimacy of any heirs that union might produce. It also eliminated a potential rallying point for political opposition, since a living former queen, even one in prison, could theoretically serve as a focus for rebellion or foreign intervention. The disposal of her body reflected the ambiguous status she held even in death, neither fully honored as a former queen nor completely dishonored as a convicted adulteress. She was buried with minimal ceremony in a tomb that marked neither her royal status nor her alleged crimes, the location of her grave, like many details of her final months, remains unknown to history. Yet Margarita's story, for all its tragic elements, illuminates important aspects of medieval royal life that often remain hidden behind the glittering facade of court ceremony and political grandeur. Her fate demonstrates how completely women, even queens, remain subject to male authority and political necessity in a world where individual desires counted for little against dynastic requirements. The Tour d'Ens also reveals the complex relationship between public reputation and political power in medieval society. Kings and queens ruled not just through military force and legal authority, but through the maintenance of moral prestige that legitimized their superior status. Any hint of sexual improperly threatened this foundation, requiring swift and decisive action to restore royal dignity and divine approval. In the broader context of medieval culture, Margarita's story reflects the tension between the ideals of courtly love celebrated in literature and music and the harsh realities of political marriage and dynastic duty. The same court that produced elaborate romantic poetry and celebrated the enabling power of passionate love also destroyed those who took such ideals too seriously or applied them too literally. As we reflect on Queen Margaret's tragic fate, we might find in her story a reminder of how completely individual happiness could be sacrificed to political necessity in medieval society, and how even the most privileged positions offered no guarantee of security or fulfillment. Her life and death serve as testimony to the human cost of the political arrangements that shaped medieval Europe, where personal desires were always subordinate to the greater needs of dynasty and kingdom. The candlelight that once illuminated her royal chambers has long since guttered out. The silk gowns that once marked her queenly status have crumbled to dust. But the story of Margarita de Borgana continues to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that behind the pageantry and ceremony of medieval royalty lay human hearts that beat with the same hopes and fears that move us still now. Let us descend from the world of the living, leaving behind both the mud of peasant villages and the silk of royal courts, to explore the silent realm that awaited all medieval souls, regardless of their earthly station. Below the cobblestones of Paris, beneath the foundations of ancient churches and the roots of old trees, lies a vast necropolis that tells the story of how an entire civilization came to terms with mortality. Close your eyes and imagine descending stone steps, worn smooth by countless footsteps, each one taking you deeper into the earth's embrace. The air grows cooler as you move away from the world of sunlight and seasons, entering a realm where time moves differently, where the concerns of daily life fade into insignificance before the ultimate democracy of death. The story of Paris's underground begins not with grand design, but with simple necessity, the kind of practical problem that medieval society solved with characteristic pragmatism and spiritual resignation. By the 12th century, the growing city faced a crisis that would have been familiar to urban centers throughout Europe. Too many dead, too little space, and the constant threat of disease from overcrowded burial grounds. Medieval Paris, like most European cities of its time, centered around its churches, and these sacred buildings served not just as places of worship, but as the primary burial sites for the faithful. The tradition of burying the dead in consecrated ground, close to the holy relics and prayers of the living community, created graveyards that grew ever more crowded as the city's population expanded. The Cemetery of the Innocents, or Des Innocents, stood at the heart of this burial system. Located near what is now Les Halles, this sacred ground had served as Paris's primary cemetery since the 12th century, receiving the bodies of ordinary citizens who could not afford private burial in church crypts or family vaults. Imagine this place in its medieval glory, a walled enclosure surrounding a small church with earth that had been turned and returned countless times to accommodate the constant stream of the departed. The cemetery operated according to a system that seemed almost industrial in its efficiency. Bodies were buried in large common graves, sometimes called fosses, which could hold dozens of corpses at once. These pits would be filled over the course of several weeks or months, then covered with earth and left to decompose naturally. After 7 to 10 years, when the soft tissues had rotted away, the graves would be reopened, and the bones removed to make space for fresh, Burials. This cycle of burial, decay, and renewal created a constantly changing landscape of death and renewal that would have been both familiar and sacred to medieval Parisians. The sight of partially decomposed bodies being assumed and repaid was not considered morbid or disturbing, but simply another aspect of the natural order, as inevitable as the changing seasons or the rising and setting of the sun. The process of handling these remains reveals much about medieval attitudes toward death and the body. The bones that were removed from the graves were not discarded as waste, but treated with reverence as the earthly remnants of souls that had once participated in the Christian community. They were carefully sorted and arranged in choral houses, covered galleries that surrounded the cemetery on three sides, creating an architectural framework for the systematic storage of human remains. These choral houses, or charts, represented one of the most distinctive features of medieval urban planning. Picture long covered walkways with stone pillars supporting timber roofs, their walls lined with carefully arranged bones that created patterns, both decorative and devotional. Skulls might be arranged in rows like a tiled floor, while longer bones were stacked in neat bundles that reached from floor to ceiling. The effect was both beautiful and unsettling, a reminder of mortality that served as a constant backdrop to the daily commerce of medieval life. For the choral houses of the Cemetery of the Innocents were not isolated from the world of the living, but integrated into the social and economic fabric of the medieval city. Merchants set up stalls beneath the bone-lined galleries, selling everything from books and parchment to religious artifacts and everyday goods. Customers would browse through displays of merchandise while surrounded by the remains of their predecessors, finding nothing incongruous about conducting business in the immediate presence of death. This mingling of commerce and mortality reflected a fundamentally different relationship between the living and the dead than exists in most modern societies. Devil people lived with constant awareness of death's proximity, not as a morbid obsession, but as a practical reality that influenced every aspect of daily life. The average person in medieval Paris would have seen more dead bodies before reaching adulthood than most modern people encounter in their entire lives, and this familiarity bred not callousness but a kind of respectful acceptance. The bones themselves became objects of veneration and contemplation, particularly as the medieval period progressed and attitudes toward death became increasingly sophisticated and codified. Visitors to the choral houses might spend hours in meditation among the remains, using the sight of empty skulls and scattered ribs as prompts for reflection on the transience of earthly life and the importance of spiritual preparation for eternity. Religious authorities encouraged this practice, seeing the choral houses as powerful tools for moral instruction. Preachers would deliver sermons surrounded by the bones of the dead, using the stark visual evidence of mortality to reinforce their messages about the need for repentance, charity, and devotion. The Latin phrase "moment more," remember, you must die, was not just a philosophical concept but a living reality, made manifest in stone and bone as the centuries passed, and the cemetery's capacity was stretched ever further. The system of bone storage became increasingly elaborate and systematized. Different sections of the choral houses were designated for remains from different time periods or social groups. Some areas were reserved for the bones of particularly holy individuals, not saints in the formal sense, but ordinary people whose lives had been marked by exceptional piety or charitable works. The arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century transformed the Cemetery of the Innocents from a crowded but manageable burial ground into a scene of almost apocalyptic overwhelm. The plague which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351 killed an estimated 1 to 3 of the population, creating a mortality crisis that strained every aspect of medieval society's capacity to deal with death. In Paris, as in cities throughout Europe, the normal procedures for burial and commemoration became impossible to maintain. Bodies accumulated faster than graves could be dug, faster than the earth could accommodate them, faster than the community could perform the religious rites that were considered essential for the soul's salvation. The careful system of burial, decomposition, and bone storage that had served the city for centuries collapsed under the weight of unprecedented mortality. Emergency measures were implemented that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Mass graves were dug, that could accommodate hundreds of bodies at once, often without the individual rites and ceremonies that medieval Christianity considered necessary for a proper Christian. Death. Families were separated in death as they had rarely been separated in life. It remains mingling anonymously in pits that were covered quickly to prevent the spread of disease. The psychological impact of this mortality crisis extended far beyond the immediate problem of disposing of corpses. Medieval society's entire framework for understanding death and its place in the divine order was challenged by the scale and apparent randomness of plague mortality. Traditional explanations for death, divine punishment for sin, natural completion of earthly life, reward for holy living, seemed inadequate to explain why the plague killed indiscriminately across all social classes and moral categories. Yet even in the midst of this crisis, the fundamental medieval commitment to honoring the dead and maintaining connection between the living and deceased communities persisted as the immediate emergency of the plague. Years passed. Efforts began to restore order to the disrupted burial system and to find appropriate ways to memorialize the unprecedented numbers who had perished. The bones of plague victims, once the immediate crisis had passed, were treated with the same reverence as those of people who had died under normal circumstances. They were carefully exhumed from the emergency burial pits, sorted according to type and condition, and incorporated into the existing choral house system that continued to serve as the primary method for managing the cemetery's limited space. This integration of plague bones into the regular choral house system represents one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval attitudes toward death and community. Rather than segregating the remains of plague victims as contaminated or cursed, medieval Parisians chose to embrace them as full members of the communion of the faithful, deserving of the same respectful treatment and memorial attention as any other Christian soul. The practical aspects of managing such vast quantities of human remains required innovations in both architecture and organization. The choral houses were expanded and redesigned to accommodate the increased volume of bones, with new galleries added and existing structures reinforced to support the weight of additional remains of specialized workers, often drawn from the ranks of religious lay brothers, developed expertise in the efficient sorting and arrangement of bones that would maximize both storage capacity and visual impact. These bone workers, whose job would seem macabre by modern standards, were regarded as performing a valuable and even holy service for the community. They developed techniques for cleaning and preparing bones that would preserve them for decades or even centuries, using lime and other natural substances to prevent decay and pest infestation. Their work required not just physical strength and tolerance for grim conditions, but genuine artistic skill in creating arrangements that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The visual impact of the expanded choral houses was extraordinary, even by the standards of a society accustomed to the presence of death in daily life. Imagine walking through galleries where walls of carefully arranged skulls stretched as far as the eye could see, punctuated by decorative patterns made from longer bones and illuminated by candles that cast dancing shadows across empty eye sockets and grinning teeth. Modern visitors to similar sites often find them disturbing or macabre, but medieval observers approach them with different expectations and cultural frameworks. For them, these displays represented not horror but hope, tangible evidence that death was not the end of human existence, but a transformation from one state of being to another. The bones were proof that the soul had moved on to its eternal destination, leaving behind only the material shell that had housed it during earthly life. Religious art of the period began to reflect the growing prominence of choral houses and bone displays in medieval urban life. Illuminated manuscripts depicted saints and angels surrounded by carefully arranged skulls and bones, while church decorations incorporated skeletal motifs that reminded worshippers of mortality's constant presence. The famous Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death tradition, which became popular throughout Europe during the later medieval period, drew much of its visual vocabulary from the choral house aesthetic. This artistic integration of death imagery into religious and secular culture helped normalize the presence of human remains in public spaces and encouraged the development of increasingly sophisticated approaches to memorial and remembrance. Wealthy families began to commission private choral houses for their own use, creating smaller-scale versions of the public galleries where their ancestors' bones could be preserved and venerated across generations. The maintenance of choral houses required considerable ongoing investment from both religious and secular authorities. The structures needed regular repair and renovation to protect the bones from weather and deterioration. The arrangement of remains needed periodic reorganization as new bones were added, and older displays were consolidated. The entire system required the services of clergy, who could provide the prayers and blessings that kept the whole enterprise within the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. Funding for these activities came from a variety of sources that reveal how deeply embedded the carnal house system was in medieval economic and social life. The church provided basic support through its regular budget for cemetery maintenance. Wealthy individuals made donations specifically designated for choral house construction and upkeep. Even ordinary citizens contributed through fees paid for burial rites and through purchases made from the merchants who operated beneath the bone-lined galleries. The international character of medieval Paris meant that the city's choral houses contained remains not just of local residents, but of visitors from throughout Europe who had died while traveling for business, pilgrimage, or diplomatic purposes. These foreign bones were incorporated into the general displays without distinction, creating memorial spaces that transcended national and cultural boundaries in ways that would have been impossible in the world of the living. Scholarly visitors from universities throughout Europe came to study the choral houses as examples of practical theology, made manifest in architecture and design. They wrote treatises on the proper arrangement of bones for maximum spiritual impact, debated the theological implications of collective versus individual memorial practices, and developed theories about the relationship between bodily remains and soul survival that influenced Christian doctrine for centuries. The carnal houses also served as informal archives of medieval life, preserving evidence of diet, disease, and living conditions that can still be studied by modern archaeologists and historians. The bones tell stories of hard physical labor, nutritional deficiencies, epidemic diseases, and violence that complement and sometimes contradict the written records left by more literate members of medieval society. As the medieval period drew to a close and Renaissance attitudes began to influence French culture, the carnal house system came under increasing criticism from reformers who found the public display of human remains unseemly and unhygienic. New approaches to urban planning emphasized the separation of the living and the dead, while medical theories about disease transmission made the proximity of decomposing bodies seem dangerous, rather than spiritually beneficial. The transformation of attitudes toward the choral houses reflected broader changes in European culture during the 15th and 16th centuries. The rise of humanism brought new emphasis on individual dignity and personal privacy that made collective bone storage seemed degrading rather than democratic. Scientific approaches to anatomy and medicine required fresh corpses for study rather than ancient bones for contemplation, and Protestant reforms challenged many Catholic practices associated with the veneration of physical remains. Yet the dismantling of the choral house system was a gradual process that took centuries to complete. Many of the bone galleries continued to operate well into the early modern period, adapting to changing cultural expectations, while maintaining their basic function as repositories for the city's dead. Some were converted into museums or historical sites that preserve their medieval character for educational purposes, while others were simply abandoned as urban development moved away from traditional cemetery locations. The final chapter in the story of Paris's medieval choral houses began in the 18th century, when Enlightenment, concerns about public health and urban hygiene led to systematic campaigns to relocate human remains from crowded city centers to purpose-built cemeteries in outlying areas. The bones that had resided in the choral houses of the Cemetery of the Innocents for hundreds of years were carefully removed and transported to new underground chambers in abandoned limestone quarries beneath the city. These quarries, originally excavated to provide building stone for medieval Paris, had been abandoned for decades when they were chosen as the new repository for the city's accumulated bones. The transfer process, which began in the 1780s, required enormous logistical coordination, as millions of skeletal remains were moved through the city streets in specially designed wagons, often under cover of darkness, to minimize disruption to daily life. The new underground cemetery, which eventually became known as the Catacombs of Paris, represented both continuity and change in the city's approach to managing its relationship with the dead. The bones were arranged in patterns that echoed the decorative traditions of the medieval choral houses, but the underground location removed them from the daily awareness of the living population in ways that would have seemed strange and even impetus to medieval sensibilities. Modern visitors to the Paris catacombs encounter the remains of this medieval bone culture in a context that emphasizes their historical and artistic, rather than spiritual, significance. The carefully arranged skulls and femurs that once served as prompts for religious meditation are now tourist attractions, photographed and commodified in ways that their medieval creators could never have imagined. Yet something of the original spirit survives in the quiet reverence that many visitors feel when confronted with such vast displays of human mortality. The bones continue to whisper their ancient message about the transience of earthly life and the universality of death, speaking across centuries to hearts that still respond to the fundamental questions that occupied their medieval predecessors. The medieval choral houses of Paris, in their original form and their modern descendant, represent one of humanity's most sustained attempts to create meaningful relationships between the living and the dead. They demonstrate how a society can acknowledge mortality without being paralyzed by it, how community bonds can extend beyond individual lifespans, and how art and spirituality can transform even the grimmest realities into sources of beauty and transcendence. As you rest now in the warmth and safety of your modern bed, consider the thousands of souls whose earthly journey ended in those medieval burial grounds, whose bones were arranged with such care in galleries where merchants sold their wares and pilgrims offered their prayers. Their names are forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but their collective presence continues to remind us that we are all participants in the same great human story, all travelers on the same journey toward whatever mystery awaits beyond the boundary of mortal life. The whispers you hear in the darkness are not threats but invitations, reminders that death is not the enemy of life but its companion. It's not the end of story, but simply another chapter in the eternal narrative that connects all human souls across the centuries. In the quiet chambers beneath Paris, surrounded by the peaceful bones of countless predecessors, you can rest in the knowledge that, whatever fears may trouble your waking hours, you are part of something larger and more enduring than any individual anxiety or sorrow. Let the gentle presence of those medieval dead comfort rather than frighten you, their bones arranged in patterns that speak of human creativity and hope, even in the face of mortality. Certainty. Sleep comes easier when we remember that we are not alone, that countless others have walked this path before us, and that the end of earthly life, maybe not a termination but a transformation into whatever forms of existence lie beyond our current understanding. Let us now ascend from the silent realm of bones and memories to the highest towers of medieval society, where privilege and power created their own peculiar forms of imprisonment. Rise with me from the underground chambers where the dead rest in eternal democracy, to the castle halls where the living enacted daily dramas of hierarchy, ceremony, and barely concealed desperation. Close your eyes and feel yourself climbing stone steps that spiral upward, each level taking you further from the earthy realities of peasant life and deeper into a world where luxury and paranoia dance together in an elaborate masquerade that never ends. The air grows warmer as you ascend, perfumed with exotic spices and the subtle sense of privilege, yet somehow no less heavy with the weight of human longing and fear. Picture yourself now standing at the great oak doors of Château de Vincennes, one of the most magnificent royal residences in 14th century France. The morning sun catches the polished metal of the door fixtures, casting patterns of light across stone walls that have been carved with intricate designs depicting hunting, scenes, heraldic symbols, and religious motifs that proclaim both earthly power and divine sanction. As the doors swing open, with the weight and grace that only master craftsmen could achieve, You enter a world that exists in stark contrast to everything we have witnessed in our journey through medieval life. Here, there are no mud floors or straw beds, no anxious glances toward storm clouds or desperate calculations of grain stores. Instead, you find yourself surrounded by tapestries that shimmer with gold thread, floors covered with carpets imported from distant lands, and an atmosphere of abundance that seems almost magical after the harsh realities of village existence. Yet as your eyes adjust to this new environment, you begin to notice details that suggest all is not as perfect as it first appears. The magnificent tapestries, for all their beauty, cannot completely conceal the dampness that seeps through stone walls, creating patches of discoloration and the faint but persistent smell of mold. The great fireplaces, massive enough to roast entire oxen, consume enormous quantities of wood but still leave the far corners of vast halls uncomfortably cold. The luxury is real, but it is luxury won through constant struggle against the same natural forces that plague the humblest peasant cottage. Your day in this castle begins before dawn, not with the rough awakening of a rooster's crow, but with the gentle touch of a personal servant whose entire existence revolves around your comfort and schedule. You are awakened not because cattle need tending or fields require attention, but because the elaborate social machinery of noble life demands your participation in a series of rituals that will consume the entire day without producing anything that could be called useful work. The servant who wakes you has been chosen not just for reliability but for discretion, for the ability to move through your most private spaces without seeing or hearing anything that might later prove inconvenient. This person knows the texture of your sleep, the sounds you make in dreams, the way you look before. The careful construction of public appearance begins each morning. Yet the relationship between you remains formal, governed by protocols that maintain hierarchical distance even in moments of physical intimacy. Your bedchamber represents luxury beyond the imagination of common folk. Yet it too reveals the limitations that constrain even the highest levels of medieval society. The bed itself is a massive construction of carved wood, draped with curtains that provide privacy and warmth. But the mattress, for all its expensive fabrics and carefully selected filling, cannot completely eliminate the discomfort of sleeping on a surface that will never achieve the flat, uniform support that modern minds take for granted. The process of dressing reveals both the privileges and burdens of noble status. Layer upon layer of clothing must be put on in precisely the correct order, each garment serving specific functions. In the complex visual language of medieval hierarchy, the finest linen undergarments speak of wealth that can afford fabric softer than anything peasants will ever touch. The richly dyed wool and outer garments proclaim status through colors that require expensive materials and skilled craftsmen to achieve. Yet each layer also represents a form of constraint, limiting movement and spontaneity in ways that peasant clothing, for all its coarseness, does not. You cannot simply dress quickly and hurry to urgent tasks. Every morning requires at least an hour of careful preparation, assisted by servants who must arrange each fold and fasten each tie according to standards that leave no room for individual preference or practical convenience. Jewelry that completes your morning transformation serves purposes far beyond mere decoration. Each piece communicates specific messages about your wealth, your family connections, your political allegiances, and your understanding of current fashion trends. The wrong choice of brooch or ring can send signals that might influence important negotiations or affect your standing in the delicate social calculations that determine success or failure in noble society. As you make your way from private chambers to the more public areas of the castle, you move through spaces designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Corridors stretch longer than entire peasant villages, their walls lined with portraits of ancestors, whose painted eyes seem to follow your progress and judge your worthiness to continue their lineage, so the very architecture serves as a constant reminder of the weight of history and expectation that rests on every decision you make. The Great Hall, where you will spend much of your day, represents the pinnacle of medieval domestic architecture. Its soaring ceiling disappears into shadows that dance with the movement of banners hanging from the rafters, each one telling stories of military victories, political alliances, and family honors accumulated over generations. The space is designed to accommodate hundreds of people when necessary. Yet this morning it feels almost empty, with only the essential household staff preparing for the day's activities. Your breakfast, served on plates of gold and silver that represent more wealth than most peasants will see in their lifetimes, consists of foods that have been selected, as much for their rarity and symbolic significance as for their nutritional value. Fresh white bread made from wheat flour that has been sifted multiple times to achieve perfect refinement, meat from animals that were raised specifically for noble tables, fed on grain that could have sustained entire families, fruits preserved in honey and exotic spices that have traveled thousands of miles to reach your table. Yet even this magnificent meal reveals the underlying anxieties that permeate noble life. Every dish must be tasted by a designated servant before you touch it. Precaution against poisoning that speaks to the constant dangers faced by those whose wealth power make them natural targets for ambitious rivals. The very abundance that surrounds you serves as a reminder that others covet what you possess and would kill to take it from you. The morning hours bring a parade of supplicants and petitioners, each seeking your intervention in matters that range from the trivial to the genuinely important. A merchant requesting safe passage for his trade caravan through lands under your protection, a mother begging for lenient treatment for a son caught poaching in your forests, a fellow noble proposing a marriage alliance that would unite your houses in mutual benefit and mutual vulnerability. Each of these interactions requires careful consideration of factors far beyond the immediate request. What are the political implications of granting or refusing each petition? How might your decision affect your relationships with other nobles whose support you need for your own ambitions? What messages are you sending about your character, your reliability, your understanding of the complex web of obligations that hold medieval society together? The weight of these decisions becomes more apparent as the morning progresses, and you begin to see how each choice creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The merchant you help today may become a valuable source of information about conditions in distant markets. The mother whose son you spare may remember your mercy when you need the loyalty of common folk. The marriage alliance you reject may drive a former friend into the arms of your enemies. This constant calculation of cause and effect, advantage and risk, creates a mental environment far more complex and demanding than anything required of peasant life, where common folk concern themselves primarily with immediate survival and the straightforward requirements of agricultural work. Nobles must navigate social and political currents that shift constantly and unpredictably, where a single mistake can destroy carefully constructed plans that have taken years to develop. The midday meal brings relief from the morning's business, but it too operates according to protocols that transform a basic human need into an elaborate social ritual. The dining hall fills with members of your household, visiting nobles, important clergy, and other figures whose presence at your table serves both to honor them and to demonstrate your own status within the broader hierarchy of medieval society. The seating arrangement at this meal follows rules as complex and rigid as any legal code. Who sits closest to you? Who is placed at the high table versus the lower tables? Who is served first and with what degree of ceremony? Every detail communicates messages about relative status, current favor, and the subtle shifts in political fortune that obsess noble society. A merchant who made his fortune through shrewd trading might find himself seated below a knight whose only qualification is ancient bloodline, but whose military service you need for upcoming campaigns. The food itself represents culinary artistry that reaches heights unknown in peasant cooking. Yet, it also reveals the peculiar limitations of medieval luxury. Elaborate dishes prepared by master cooks who treat their craft as high art, swans roasted and fathered to appear lifelike castles constructed entirely from sugar and marzipan. Entire meals designed around specific color schemes that require ingredients to be imported from across the known world. Yet for all this sophistication, the underlying technology remains fundamentally medieval. No, refrigeration means that even the freshest ingredients carry risks of spoilage and contamination. No, understanding of nutrition means that meals designed for maximum visual impact often provide poor sustenance for bodies that require real nourishment. No, effective preservation methods mean that even the wealthiest households face genuine hardship during winter months, when fresh ingredients become unavailable at any price. The afternoon brings different challenges as you participate in the recreational activities that occupy much of noble life during peacetime. Hunting expeditions that require the coordination of dozens of servants, horses, and hunting dogs in pursuit of deer, boar, or other game that serves as much a symbol of noble prowess as a source of food. These hunts recreate the excitement and danger of military campaigns without the genuine risks of warfare, providing outlets for aggressive energy while reinforcing the martial values that justify noble privilege. Yet even these pleasurable activities reveal underlying tensions and anxieties, the elaborate protocols that govern hunting. Parties create opportunities for both alliance building and subtle insults. Who is invited to participate? Who is given the honor of the first kill? Who rides closest to the host? Every detail carries political significance that must be carefully managed to avoid giving offense or creating new enemies among people whose goodwill you need for your own security and advancement. The evening hours bring the day's most elaborate social rituals as the Great Hall transforms into a stage for displays of wealth, culture, and political sophistication. Dinner in a noble household during the 14th century represents one of the most complex social performances in human history, combining elements of theater, diplomacy, religious observance, artistic exhibition in a single extended ceremony that can last for several hours. The procession that brings the evening's food to the high table operates according to choreography as precise as any court dance. Servants, in livery that proclaim their allegiance to your house, carry silver platters arranged in specific orders that honor both religious significance and social hierarchy. The first course might include dozens of individual dishes, each prepared according to recipes that have been refined over generations and represent the accumulated wisdom of master cooks whose techniques are guarded as carefully as military secrets. Music provides constant accompaniment to the meal performed by musicians, whose skill represents another form of luxury that separates noble from common life. Providers who can compose verses that flatter their patrons while entertaining the assembled company. Instrumentalists whose mastery of lute, harp, and other complex instruments creates atmospheric background for conversation and negotiation. Singers whose voices can fill the great hall with melodies that celebrate both earthly achievements and divine glory. The conversation that flows around the high table during these extended meals reveals the intellectual world of medieval nobility, a realm of concerns and interests that differs dramatically from the immediate practical focus of peasant life. Discussions of philosophy and theology that draw on the latest works of university scholars. Reports from travelers who have visited distant courts and can share news of political developments, cultural innovations, and religious movements that might affect local conditions. Analysis of military campaigns, trade routes, diplomatic negotiations, and other matters that require broad knowledge and sophisticated judgment. Yet beneath the surface sophistication, these conversations often reveal the same basic anxieties that trouble all human communities. Who can be trusted with sensitive information? Which alliances offer genuine security and which might prove treacherous when tested? How can individual ambitions be pursued without destroying the cooperative relationships that make civilized life possible? The setting may be luxurious and the language elevated, but the underlying concerns remain fundamentally human. The entertainment that follows the meal provides insights into the cultural values and artistic achievements of medieval noble society. Performances by professional entertainers who specialize in different forms of aristocratic amusement. Acrobats, whose physical skills amaze audiences accustomed to lives of relative physical ease. Storytellers, whose narratives blend historical events with romantic fantasy. Dancers, whose movements embody the grace and elegance that noble society cultivates as marks of superior breeding. These performances serve multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. They provide opportunities for nobles to demonstrate their cultural sophistication and their ability to attract the finest talent to their courts. They offer relatively safe ways to explore controversial or sensitive topics through the medium of artistic representation. They create shared experiences that can build bonds among people who might otherwise view each other primarily as competitors for limited resources and opportunities. The religious observances that punctuate noble daily life take forms that differ significantly from the simpler devotions of peasant Communities. Private chapels within castle. Walls allow for more elaborate and personalized worship experiences. Personal. Chaplain provides spiritual guidance tailored to the specific moral challenges faced by those who wield power over others. Religious art and architecture of extraordinary beauty and complexity create environments designed to inspire both awe and contemplation. Yet these privileges also create spiritual burdens unknown to simpler folk. The responsibility for making decisions that affect the lives and souls of many others weighs heavily on consciences that have been trained to consider both earthly and eternal consequences. The wealth that makes elaborate religious observance possible also creates temptations and moral dilemmas that test faith in ways that poverty, for all its hardships, does not. The private moments that punctuate your day in the castle reveal aspects of noble life that public ceremonies and social rituals carefully conceal. Time spent alone in your chamber, reading manuscripts that contain the accumulated wisdom of classical authors, medieval philosophers, and contemporary thinkers who grapple with questions of governance, morality, and the proper ordering of human society. These solitary hours provide opportunities for reflection and self-examination that the constant demands of public performance rarely allow. Yet even privacy remains relative. In a world where servants must attend to your most basic needs, where security requires constant vigilance against potential threats, where the very architecture of castle life makes true solitude nearly impossible to achieve, your private thoughts remain more private than those of peasants who share single-room cottages with their entire families. But they are still subject to observation and interpretation by those whose proximity to power makes them both valuable and dangerous. The evening's end brings its own elaborate rituals. As the household prepares for sleep, servants who will maintain watch throughout the night ensure that fires remain banked against the morning's need, that weapons remain ready for use against unexpected threats, that the complex mechanisms of castle security continue to function even when their lord rests. The process of undressing reverses the morning's careful construction of public appearance, stripping away the layers of symbolism and display, to reveal the vulnerable human form that all the ceremony and protocol exist to protect and elevate. Your bed, for all its luxury, cannot guarantee peaceful sleep. The same minds that spend their days calculating political advantage and social positioning continued to work through the night, processing the day's interactions, planning future strategies, worrying about potential threats and missed opportunities. The comfort of fine mattresses and warm coverings cannot fully compensate for the mental burdens that come with power and responsibility. Dreams, when they come, often reflect the pressures and anxieties of waking life, nightmares of betrayal by trusted allies, of military defeat at the hands of better prepared enemies, of social disgrace that could destroy carefully constructed reputations and reduce noble families to poverty and obscurity. Even in sleep, the mind that must constantly navigate the treacherous currents of medieval politics finds no complete rest from its burdens. The winter months bring their own particular challenges to castle life, revealing how even the highest levels of medieval society remain subject to the same natural forces that govern peasant existence. Despite massive fireplaces and the best heating technology available, castle halls become drafty and uncomfortable when storms rage outside their walls. Despite elaborate food storage systems and the wealth to purchase supplies from distant markets, noble tables suffer when widespread crop failures affect entire regions. The isolation that winter imposes on castle communities creates unique social dynamics, as the same people who might normally travel between different courts and households find themselves confined together for months at a time. Personality conflicts that might be manageable when people can avoid each other become serious. Problems when escape is impossible. Romance and intrigue that might remain minor entertainment during seasons of greater mobility can develop into serious complications when their participants cannot separate. These confined winter months also provide opportunities for activities that the busier seasons make difficult to pursue. Extended reading of classical and contemporary texts that require sustained attention and careful study. Detailed planning for military campaigns. Building projects and political initiatives that will be undertaken when spring makes action possible again. Intensive training in martial arts, musical performance, and other skills that noble education considers essential but that require time and concentration to master. The religious calendar that structures medieval noble life becomes particularly important during these darker months, providing a framework of meaning and purpose that helps communities maintain their cohesion when external activities become limited. The elaborate celebrations of Christmas, Epiphany, and other major feasts create occasions for display and festivity that break the monotony of winter confinement while reinforcing the spiritual values that supposedly justify noble privilege. The Bedtime season that follows Christmas brings its own disciplines and observances as noble households attempt to follow religious requirements for fasting and penance while maintaining the social obligations that their status demands. The result is often a complex balance between spiritual discipline and practical necessity. Religious ideals encounter the realities of political and social responsibilities that cannot be suspended, even for the highest spiritual purposes. Spring's arrival transforms castle life as dramatically as it changes peasant existence, though in different ways. The resumption of travel and communication with the outside world brings news of political developments, opportunities for new alliances and ventures, and relief from the social pressures that winter confinement creates. The return of fresh foods and improved weather conditions raises spirits and energy levels that have been depleted by months of limited variety and indoor confinement. Yet spring also brings renewed awareness of the threats and challenges that make noble life perpetually uncertain. Reports of military movements by potential enemies, news of political changes that might affect established alliances, information about economic conditions that could impact the sources of wealth on which noble power depends. The same season that brings relief from winter's hardships also brings renewed engagement with the complex and dangerous world of medieval politics. The agricultural activities that occupy spring months on noble lands require different forms of attention and management than peasant farming. They remain central to noble welfare and security. Decisions about crop selection, land allocation, and resource distribution must be made with consideration for both immediate needs and long-term strategic planning. The success or failure of these decisions will determine not only the household's comfort and prosperity, but also its ability to meet military obligations, maintain political alliances, and support the complex social infrastructure that noble life requires. The hunting seasons that resume with spring weather provide not only recreation and fresh meat, but also opportunities for the kind of social networking that medieval politics requires. Hunting parties that include members of different noble families create informal settings for negotiation and alliance building that complement the more formal diplomatic interactions of official visits and court ceremonies. The skills demonstrated in pursuit of game serve as metaphors for the military prowess that remains the ultimate foundation of noble power. Summer brings the campaign season, when the military obligations that justify noble privilege must be fulfilled through actual service in warfare or the threat of warfare. Even nobles who prefer the arts of peace to the business of war must maintain their martial skills and their ability to mobilize effective military forces when duty or necessity requires. The romantic ideals of chivalry that noble culture celebrates exist in constant tension with the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The castle's role as a defensive stronghold becomes most apparent during times of military threat, when its high walls, strong gates, strategic position transform from impressive architectural features into essential survival tools. The same halls that host elaborate feasts and cultural entertainments can become command centers for military operations that determine the fate of entire regions. The luxury that defines noble life in peacetime must be quickly adapted to the harsh requirements of siege warfare or military campaigns. The transition between these different aspects of castle life, from cultural salon to military headquarters, from diplomatic center to defensive fortress, requires a flexibility and adaptability that few other social roles demand. Noble families must maintain expertise in areas as diverse as military strategy, agricultural management, diplomatic negotiation, cultural patronage, and spiritual leadership. The breadth of knowledge and skill required explains both the extensive education that noble children receive and the intense pressure that noble adults face in meeting the multiple demands of their station. The economic foundations of noble life remain as precarious as those of peasant existence, though the risks take different forms. Where peasants worry about crop failure and famine, nobles concern themselves with the complex financial arrangements that support their households, the political stability that guarantees their land tenure, and the military effectiveness that protects their holdings from ambitious rivals. Wealth brings security in some respects, while creating new forms of vulnerability in others. The daily routine of castle life, for all its luxury and ceremony, often proves as repetitive and constraining as peasant existence, though in different ways. Where peasants are bound by the rhythms of agricultural work and seasonal change, nobles find themselves trapped by the demands of social protocol, political obligation, and the constant need to maintain appearances that justify their privileged position. Freedom in the modern sense of individual choice and personal autonomy remains as elusive for the highest lords as for the humblest serfs. The relationships that sustain noble households reveal both the possibilities and limitations of medieval social organization. Deep bonds of loyalty and affection can develop between lords and their followers, creating communities of mutual support that transcend the purely economic relationships of feudal obligation. Yet these same relationships remain fundamentally hierarchical, constrained by legal and social traditions that limit the equality and reciprocity that true friendship requires. The education that prepares noble children for their future roles reflects the complexity and contradictions of their social position. Training in military skills that may prove essential for survival exists alongside instruction in classical literature and philosophy that cultivates refined sensibilities. Practical lessons in estate management and political negotiation complement theoretical studies of theology and ethics that address the moral dimensions of power and authority. The marriage patterns that connect noble families create networks of alliance and obligation that extend across political boundaries and persist through generations. Individual romantic preferences must be balanced against family interests, political necessities, and strategic considerations that affect not only the immediate participants, but their children, their retainers, and their broader communities. Love, when it develops within these arranged marriages, represents a fortunate bonus rather than an expected foundation. The religious dimensions of noble life encompass both genuine spiritual seeking and calculated political positioning. As families seek to demonstrate their piety while maintaining their secular interests, patronage of churches and monasteries serves both to secure divine favor and to create institutional allies in the complex political games that determine success or failure. In medieval society, the line between authentic devotion and strategic calculation remains blurred in ways that would surprise modern sensibilities. As your day in the castle draws to a close and you prepare once again for sleep and luxury that millions of your contemporaries cannot imagine, you carry with you the accumulated weight of countless decisions, observations, and interactions that will influence not only your own future, but the futures of all those whose lives intersect with yours. The burden of privilege proves as real as its benefits, creating psychological pressures that wealth and power cannot fully alleviate. The darkness that falls over the castle at night brings the same universal peace that settles over peasant cottages and royal palaces alike, reminding all who experience it that human distinctions of rank and status fade before the greater mysteries of existence that no earthly power can fully comprehend or control. In sleep, the lord and the serf find the same rest, the same escape from the particular burdens of their waking roles, the same brief reunion with the fundamental humanity that social hierarchy tends to obscure. The castle walls that provide security from external threats cannot protect their inhabitants from the internal struggles that define the human condition in any era. The search for meaning and purpose, the desire for genuine connection with others, the fear of mortality and the unknown, the tension between individual desires and communal obligations. These universal challenges take different forms at different social levels, but they remain essentially the same, regardless of the material circumstances in which they are experienced. And so our gentle journey through the medieval world draws to its close like a candle flickering lower, as the night deepens and dawn still lies hours away. We have walked together through mud-soaked villages where life meant survival, and survival meant endless toil. We have witnessed the tragic fall of a queen, whose story reminds us that even power cannot protect against the consequences of passion and political machination. Furthermore, we have descended into the bone-like chambers beneath Paris, where death and faith created monuments to human mortality that whisper across the centuries, and we have climbed to the highest towers of privilege, discovering that luxury brings its own forms of captivity, and that power creates burdens as real as its benefits. Through each of these worlds, peasant and royal, living and dead, struggling and prosperous, we have seen the same fundamental human truths play out in different costumes and settings. The need for community and connection that makes isolation unbearable, whether in a crowded cottage or a vast castle hall. The search for meaning and purpose that drives both the humblest field worker and the most elevated noble to seek something beyond mere survival, universal experience of mortality that reduces all human distinctions to dust and memory, making equals of king and commoner in the democracy of the grave. The medieval world we have explored together was harsh in ways that modern life has largely forgotten. It possessed qualities that our own era sometimes struggles to achieve. The sense of belonging to something larger than oneself that came naturally to people who lived there. Entire lives within small, stable communities. The integration of spiritual and material concerns that made every aspect of daily life potentially sacred. The acceptance of natural rhythms and limitations that brought its own forms of peace and contentment, despite material hardship. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people possessed a relationship with time and mortality that allowed them to find meaning and beauty even in the midst of suffering and uncertainty. They built cathedrals that would take centuries to complete, created artworks that celebrated divine glory rather than human achievement, and developed social institutions designed to outlast any individual lifetime. Their sense of connection to both past and future generations created a kind of immortality that transcended personal death and gave individual lives significance within larger narratives of human purpose and divine plan. The contrasts we have explored between the mud of peasant life and the silk of royal courts, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, between the harsh realities of survival and the luxurious constraints of privilege, remind us that every era contains multiple realities, multiple ways of being human within the same historical moment. The medieval world was not a single, unified experience, but a complex tapestry of different lives, different challenges, different forms of suffering and joy. Yet through all these differences, certain constants emerge that connect medieval people to ourselves across the centuries that separate us. The desire for love and companionship that made both peasant marriages and royal alliances more than mere economic arrangements. The capacity for creating beauty that transformed simple churches into architectural marvels and elevated bone storage into forms of sacred art. The resilience that allowed people to find hope and meaning, even in circumstances that would challenge the strongest spirits. As you settle deeper into your modern comfort, your clean sheets and soft pillows, your house with its walls that keep out both weather and unwanted visitors, your medicine cabinet stocked with remedies that medieval people would have considered miraculous, you might feel a moment of gratitude for the distance that separates your life from the harsh realities we have explored together. The simple fact that you can listen to these stories for entertainment rather than living them for survival represents a kind of privilege that would have been unimaginable to most medieval people. Yet, perhaps you might also feel a touch of envy for some aspects of the world. We have left behind the sense of belonging that came from living your entire life among people who knew your family's history for generations. The integration of work and meaning that made even hard labor a form of participation in divine creation. The acceptance of natural rhythms that brought its own forms of peace and contentment. Despite material limitations, the medieval people whose lives we have shared tonight were not so different from ourselves and their fundamental humanity, to their capacity for both cruelty and kindness, their ability to create beauty and meaning, even in the midst of hardship and uncertainty. They loved their children as fiercely as we love ours, grieved their losses as deeply as we grieve ours, and found ways to laugh and celebrate and hope, despite circumstances that would challenge the strongest spirits. Their world was smaller than ours, in some ways bounded by the distances. A person could travel on foot or horseback. For I don't ask the mentor, constrained by social hierarchies that offered little possibility for individual advancement. Yet it was also larger than ours in other ways, more open to mystery and miracle, more accepting of the unknown and unknowable, more willing to find significance in small things and patient enough to wait for outcomes that might not arrive for generations. The stories we have shared tonight continue to resonate because they speak to experiences and emotions that remain fundamentally human, regardless of the historical context in which they occur. The struggle for survival that occupied so much of medieval life continues in different forms today. The search for meaning and purpose that drove both peasants and nobles to seek something beyond mere material existence remains as urgent now as it was then. The confrontation with mortality that shaped medieval attitudes toward life and death continues to challenge and inspire us in our own time. As sleep approaches and these medieval voices fade back into the silence from which we briefly called them, you might carry with you some of the wisdom that emerges from contemplating lives so different from your own, yet so recognizably human in their essential qualities: the patience that comes from accepting limitations that cannot be changed, the resilience that finds ways to create beauty and meaning even in difficult circumstances, the perspective that sees individual troubles as part of larger patterns that have challenged human beings throughout history. The darkness that surrounds you now is the same darkness that settled over medieval villages and castle halls, the same night sky that provided comfort and mystery to people who lived without electric lights. Our modern understanding of astronomy? In this darkness, the boundaries between past and present seem less absolute, the connections between different human experiences more apparent, the great continuities of human nature more evident than the surface differences that usually occupy our attention. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of a story that began long before your birth and will continue long after your death. A narrative that includes both the humblest medieval peasant and the mightiest king, both the anonymous bones in Parisian catacombs and the celebrated figures whose names appear in history books. Your own chapter in this great human story matters as much as any other. Your own struggles and achievements as significant as those of the medieval people whose lives we have explored together. The medieval world we have visited tonight exists now only in memory and imagination, in the artifacts they left behind and the influences they continue to exert on our own time. Yet something of their spirit survives, and every person who finds ways to create meaning and beauty despite difficult circumstances, who maintains hope in the face of uncertainty, who seeks connection with others across the boundaries that seem to divide us, sleep peacefully now, surrounded by comforts they could never have imagined, yet sharing with them the fundamental human experience of consciousness gradually fading into rest of individual awareness, dissolving back into the larger mystery from which it emerged and to which it will return. In sleep as in death, all human distinctions fade before the greater realities that unite us across centuries and continents in the common adventure of being human. The medieval world sleeps with you tonight, its voices joining the chorus of all human experience that whispers through your dreams, reminding you that you are never alone, never the first to face whatever challenges occupy your waking hours, never without the company of countless others who have walked similar paths and found ways to endure, to hope and to find meaning in the brief, precious gift of consciousness that we all share. Let the gentle presence of these medieval souls accompany you into whatever rest awaits your struggles and victories, becoming part of your own story, their wisdom and resilience, strengthening you for whatever tomorrow may bring. The great human conversation continues, and you are part of it as much as they were, as much as those who will come after us will be in their turn. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler. The medieval world bids you farewell, but the connections we have forged tonight between past and present, between their lives and yours, will endure as long as human. Memory and human imagination continue to find meaning in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we have been. The castle gates close. The village settles into silence. The bones rest peacefully in their underground chambers, and all is well in the great continuity of human experience. that connects us all across the centuries, in bonds stronger than time and deeper than death.